A very happy new year to you all. Now, I'm going to start 2025 with some exciting news of the recent discovery of hidden treasure in Vilnius Cathedral in Lithuania. It is a very recent discovery indeed and was made only in mid-December of 2024. It is a discovery that I'm sure you'll find as fascinating as I do, for not only is it royal regalia that has been found, but it is 16th century funerary regalia, objects that were used to adorn the bodies of members of the Lithuanian and Polish royal families when they were buried. It is not the first time that these objects have been seen. They were first discovered, as we will see, in 1931. But in 1939 they were all wrapped up and hidden away, and the place of their concealment was lost until last December. Now, before we get on to the nitty-gritty of this amazing find, we must begin, if we are to understand these fascinating objects, by the context in which they were made, the early modern state of Lithuania. Lithuania, which is in Eastern Europe, and in the modern era after the fall of communism is a democratic republic, was from the 13th century until 1795 a curious entity called a Grand Duchy, and it was ruled from Vilnius, which is still the modern capital. 14th century Lithuania was not simply confined to the borders of the modern state, but included great swathes of territory running from the Baltic nearly to the Black Sea, among them Belarus and the vast majority of the western part of the modern state of the Ukraine. The geopolitical issues we see playing out in the Ukraine today began in part with the creation of the Lithuanian Empire in the 14th century. In the 1380s, this enormous duchy was ruled by a pagan ruler called Jogaila, who in 1386 was married to Jadwiga, the female king of Poland. Yes, you have heard me right, she was crowned King of Poland rather than the Queen in 1383. Duke Jogaila was crowned as co-sovereign of Poland with his new wife in 1386, and so from that point onwards until 1655, successive Lithuanian Grand Dukes were usually simultaneously the kings of Poland too. Although some of the earlier Lithuanian rulers had been Christians, it was only in 1386, as part of the marriage settlement between Jogaila and Jadwiga, that Lithuania became a Christian country. Although caught between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, the influence of Poland ensured that it was Catholicism rather than Eastern Orthodoxy that became the state religion of Lithuania. Now, Jogaila found it difficult to run such a large empire, and so he gave over much of the running of the Grand Duchy to his cousin Vytautas. And Vytautas, who is known as Vytautas the Great in Lithuania, pushed the boundaries of the new empire as far south as the Black Sea and the borders of the Crimea. By the time of his death in 1430, the personal political union of Poland and Lithuania was the largest single state entity in the whole of Europe. The first Grand Duke of Lithuania, Mindaugas, had constructed a wooden church beside his castle in Vilnius when he had converted to Christianity in 1251, and this seems to have still been standing in the late 14th century. But in 1387, when Lithuania became a Christian state, this was then replaced with a new Gothic stone cathedral. This first stone cathedral was burnt down in 1419 to be replaced in 1429 by a second Gothic church commissioned by Vytautas. This building was constructed in a style that was very much influenced by Polish Gothic architecture, and it was intended by Vytautas to be a place where the Grand Dukes would be both crowned and buried, and indeed in 1430, when he died, he was buried in it. Among the rulers of Lithuania and Poland buried in Vilnius Cathedral in successive centuries was King Alexander, the grandson of Jogaila. He was Grand Duke from 1492 and then became King of Poland from 1501 until his death in 1506. Now, Alexander was succeeded in his rule by his brother Sigismund I, and in 1529 King Sigismund I, once again finding the Polish-Lithuanian Empire to be too large for one man to manage, began to rule jointly with his son Sigismund II Augustus, an arrangement that persisted until Sigismund I's death in 1548. Sigismund II would then continue to rule both countries until his own death in 1572. Now, Sigismund II was married 3 times. He was firstly married in 1543 to Elizabeth of Austria, the eldest daughter of the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I. The marriage between Sigismund and Elizabeth was, it seems, an unhappy one. Sigismund, therefore, took a mistress, a widow called Barbara Radziwiłł. From 1544, Sigismund and Elizabeth were resident in, and they ruled from Vilnius. Sadly, young Queen Elizabeth appears to have had epilepsy, and she died at the royal palace in Vilnius following a seizure, aged only 18, on the 5th of June 1545. The following month, she was buried in Vilnius Cathedral. In July or August of 1547, Sigismund then married, in secret, his former mistress Barbara. This marriage was not a popular move. It was opposed by the nobility and by the king's parents, particularly by his mother, Bona Sforza, who was only told of the match in early 1548. Eventually, however, the marriage came to be accepted, and in December of 1550, Barbara was crowned as Queen of Poland. Although only in her mid to late 20s, Barbara quickly sickened, and she died in May of 1551 of an indeterminate stomach complaint, most probably cancer. Although dying in Poland, she wished to be buried in Vilnius, and so her body was prepared by being embedded in ash and lime for the long journey ahead, and she was buried on the 23rd of June 1551, only 6 years after her predecessor Queen Elizabeth, in the same burial vault as her in Vilnius Cathedral. Now, Vilnius Cathedral had been rather battered since the 1550s through both fire and war, and it was in a very poor condition, so much so that it was almost entirely rebuilt between 1779 and 1801. Inwardly and outwardly, it is a classical structure now, but within the present fabric is immured the remains of the late Gothic church that Vytautas built. The burial place of the various kings and queens buried in the cathedral were not disturbed when this building work occurred in the 18th century, but unmarked, their location within this newly restored structure was lost. In April of 1931, there was a catastrophic flood in Vilnius when the rivers Neris and Vilnia burst their banks. This flooding badly damaged the foundations and the structure of the cathedral, and operations were undertaken beneath the floor to stabilise and underpin the building. During this work, a brick-lined burial vault was discovered under the floor of the west end of the choir of the cathedral. As it was entered and a light was brought in for the first time, a glint of gold was seen, and like Howard Carter, as he first gazed upon the tomb of Tutankhamun, the investigators knew they had found something unique and of importance within. It had been hoped that this was the burial place of Vytautas the Great, who is a national hero in Lithuania, but it proved otherwise. It turned out that this vault contained the remains of King Alexander and of the two queens consort of Sigismund II, Queen Elizabeth and Queen Barbara. The vault was presumably made to receive the body of King Alexander, and his remains were found in the very centre of it, between the skeletons of the two queens. Due to frequent flooding over the centuries, the coffins of the three individuals were in a very poor condition, as were the bones of both King Alexander and Queen Elizabeth. The top of the coffin of Queen Barbara, covered in fine fabric, was preserved, and her bones were found to be in much better condition than the others, perhaps due to the ash and lime that had been packed around her corpse. But all three bodies were buried with crowns and other grave goods. The bones in these grave goods were removed, and the bones were then placed in new coffins, which were then interred in the crypt below the 17th century chapel that contains the relics of St. Casimir, King Alexander's brother. The bones still remain there, and replicas of the three crowns lie upon them. These wonderful grave goods were photographed and analysed, but they were never put on display. And in 1939, following the Nazi invasion of Poland and the beginning of the Second World War, they were wrapped up and were then walled up in part of the crypt of the cathedral to preserve them. And the location of the hidden grave goods was then lost. There have been various attempts over the past 40 years to find that secret hiding place, including the use in 2009 of geo, radar and thermal imaging technology, but every attempt proved futile. A further attempt was made in 2019 using 3D imaging to determine a possible hiding place, but that had to stop due to funding constraints. Then, in October of 2024, the decision was taken to try to determine the hiding place using an endoscopic camera that could reach into crevices within the crypt walls. On December the 16th, 2024, that survey took place, and the hiding place of the crowns and other grave goods came to light. Walling was removed, and these precious objects were found within a cavity, all wrapped up in cardboard and in browned newspaper. So what are the objects found? Well, they are a mixture of personal items worn by the individuals in their life and mortuary regalia made for the sole purpose of burial. There are 3 crowns, and the largest of these is the crown of King Alexander, and it was found encircling his skull in 1931. This is without question a mortuary crown. It's a circlet topped with fleurons, and it is made of a copper base metal that has then been gilded. The king was also found to be wearing 2 gold rings, and these were found last December too, and he was also girded with a sword. Now the remnants of this iron sword were hidden too in 1939 with other objects from the cathedral treasury, and it was discovered walled up with them in the crypt in 1985. The crown of Queen Elizabeth, which is also made of gilt base metal, is rather more delicate and feminine than that of King Alexander, and it was in fact found not on her head but resting on a stone block next to her coffin. Queen Elizabeth did, however, have a number of grave goods that were evidently personal items of hers that were buried with her, and the most prominent of these was a chain of gold that was hung around her neck, from which was hanging this medallion with a portrait of her husband, King Sigismund. This chain is not unlike the chain and medallion that her successor Barbara is shown wearing in her portrait by Lucas Cranach. Elizabeth was also found wearing a very fine gold ring. The grave goods of Queen Barbara are much more lavish than those of Queen Elizabeth. Around her head was found a crown made of silver gilt. It is decorated with fleur-de-lis, the circlet engraved with flowers and set with fictive glass stones. With her were found other items of regalia too, all made of silver gilt. A sceptre and an orb topped with a cross, both resembling those used by the Holy Roman imperial family. It is known that the Polish royal regalia emulated imperial practice. One wonders if these fine objects, which would have been very expensive, were made for the Queen's coronation in December of 1550. Queen Barbara was also wearing some personal jewellery, including this beautiful and very heavy multi-stranded gold chain, and 2 rings, including this fine gold engraved and enamel ring set with a ruby, a diamond and an emerald. Queen Elizabeth was without question buried with great honour by her husband Sigismund, but one can't help thinking that the particular lavishness of Barbara's grave goods indicate Sigismund's greater affection for her. The coffin plates that were once fixed to the coffins of the deceased and gave their names, their styles and titles were also among the hoard buried in the wall. These were found in 1931 among their respective bones, which is how the remains were identifiable. It is wonderful these treasures have been found again and will be preserved for us to enjoy. Such royal grave goods, usually still entombed, rarely come to light. When they do, they provide a vivid insight into the splendour of historic royal funerary practice as kings and queens went to their graves dressed as they were in life. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.